Our channel shares stories that actually happened. Do you know or have experienced any shocking stories? We also tell the stories of our subscribers. Leave them in the comments so we can share them with the world. We want to hear from you. That morning began like any other, with the sound of wind rattling the poorly sealed windows of the small house. She woke before dawn, as she had done since she started planning her escape. Every movement was calculated, every sound analyzed with the care of someone who knew a single mistake could be fatal. The belongings she would take with her were hidden in different spots around the house. Important documents inside a hollowed-out book, cash under a loose floorboard, a few family photos tucked into her underwear. As she meticulously folded a change of clothes, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline of knowing this time would be different. The pre-dawn silence was deceptive. She knew danger could be lurking behind that calm. She paused when she heard a creak in the next room, her heart pounding, but she kept going, taking deep breaths to steady herself. The plan was clear in her mind. Wait for him to leave for work, take the essentials, and disappear before noon. But fate had other plans. Just when she thought everything was going as intended, she heard the unmistakable sound of the front door swinging open violently. Time seemed to freeze. Her muscles tensed, bracing for the worst. In that instant, she knew the confrontation she had tried so hard to avoid was inevitable. Without a second thought, she grabbed the phone she always kept charged and hidden, quickly dialing emergency services with fingers that seemed to move on their own. As she waited for an answer, her eyes scanned the room for something. Anything she could use to defend herself. The voice on the other end sounded distant at first, but when she began speaking, her words were clear and precise, whispering her address and explaining the situation in hurried breaths. She hung up just in time to hear heavy footsteps approaching down the hallway. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door and she held her breath. The knob turned slowly, revealing the figure that had haunted her worst nightmares for years. He smelled of alcohol and cigarettes as always, but today there was something different in his gaze. A sharper, more calculated fury. His eyes quickly scanned the room, landing on the half-zipped backpack on the bed. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. She felt every muscle in her body tense, preparing for the inevitable. When he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm, which frightened her even more. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, stepping slowly toward her. At that moment, she knew excuses would be useless. In one swift motion, she grabbed the scissors she had hidden under her pillow that morning, keeping them out of his sight but ready to use if necessary. Her mind raced through all the escape routes she had memorized over the months. The bathroom window, the back door leading to the yard, even the closet connecting to the next room. But before she could act, he hurled the backpack against the wall, scattering its contents across the floor. The photos of her children lay exposed, and when she saw his expression change, she knew he had crossed a dangerous line. The distant sound of sirens seemed to snap them both out of the trance. He turned his head toward the window, cursing under his breath, and that split-second distraction was all she needed. With a strength she didn't know she had, she lunged forward, sprinting down the hallway as his curses echoed behind her. The wooden floor creaked under her bare feet, and the air burned her lungs. But she didn't stop. She knew this was her only chance. When she reached the front door, her trembling fingers fumbled with the lock until it finally gave way, just as he caught up to her. The dawn light blinded her for a moment, but she kept running toward the street where she saw with relief the flashing lights of a police car speeding toward her. The cold asphalt of the street stung her bare feet as she ran toward the officers stepping out of the vehicle. Words tumbled from her mouth in a frantic, incoherent stream, broken explanations, warnings about him, pleas for protection for her children. One officer quickly guided her into the back seat of the patrol car, while the others headed toward the house. From her position, she could see the front door wide open, but he didn't come out. The minutes that followed were a blur of questions, phone calls, and voices trying to calm her. They offered her a blanket, which she refused at first until she realized her whole body was shaking uncontrollably. A younger officer asked if she needed medical attention, but she could only shake her head, her eyes fixed on the entrance of the house that had been her prison for so long. When they finally brought him out, handcuffed and protesting, she felt a strange mix of relief and terror. He stared directly at her through the car window, and that look chilled her blood. But this time, instead of lowering her gaze as she used to, she held it. Something inside her had shifted forever in that moment. The officers explained they would take her to a temporary shelter, far from there where she'd be safe. As the car pulled away, she took one last look at the house that had been both her home and her hell. The bedroom curtains fluttered in the wind, briefly revealing the chaos left behind. The torn backpack, her belongings scattered, the photos of her children trampled on the floor. But instead of sadness, she felt a determination she hadn't known in years. She knew the road ahead would be hard. Endless paperwork, court dates, sleepless nights. But for the first time in a long time, she also knew it was worth fighting for. As the car turned the corner and the house disappeared from view, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, picturing her children's faces waiting for her somewhere safe. The officer driving said something, but his words were lost in the sound of her own heart pounding, not from fear now, but from something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The shelter wasn't what she had imagined. It was clean, well lit, with walls painted in warm colors that tried to offset the institutional coldness of the hallways. A social worker named Laura greeted her with a cup of tea and a calm voice that didn't ask unnecessary questions. They showed her to her room, small, impersonal, but with a window that let in the afternoon sun. It was more than she'd expected. As she packed the few belongings they'd brought her in a paper bag, her ID, some cash the police had recovered, a borrowed phone, she noticed her hands had stopped shaking. The legal process started almost immediately. A court-appointed lawyer arrived that same afternoon to explain the charges against him, the restraining order, the next steps. Words like domestic violence, assault, and imminent danger hung in the air, but she could barely focus. The only thing she wanted to know was when she could see her children. The social worker explained the protocol: psychological evaluation first, then supervised visits, then maybe eventually temporary custody. Frustration washed over her for a moment, but then she remembered that at least now there was a plan, a clear path forward, unlike before when every day was a painful uncertainty. That night, lying in the narrow but clean bed at the shelter, she listened to the sounds of the building, someone crying in the next room, the footsteps of staff making nighttime rounds, the distant hum of the city. She expected to feel fear, nostalgia, even regret. But instead, there was only a deep exhaustion, the kind that follows a long and difficult battle. Before falling asleep, she did something she hadn't done in years. She prayed, not to any particular saint, but to the universe, to life, to whatever might be listening. She didn't ask for strength or courage, just the chance to start over. When sleep finally came, it brought no nightmares as she'd feared, but a deep, restorative silence. The next morning she woke to the first ray of sunlight through the window, and for a moment, before remembering where she was and why, she felt a peace she hadn't known since childhood. Then reality returned, but this time with a different tone. It wasn't fear driving her now, but the certainty that for the first time in years she was in control of her own life. The following days were a whirlwind of paperwork and endless meetings. Each morning began the same way, waking up early, dressing in the donated clothes she'd been given, simple but clean items that no longer smelled like fear, and waiting her turn to use the shelter's phone. The calls to her children's school were the hardest, hearing their voices on the other end trying to sound normal as they told her about homework assignments, as if nothing had changed. The social worker had warned her not to tell them where she was for safety, so she made up excuses about a work trip she'd never planned to take. In the afternoons, while waiting for her counseling session, she sat in the small courtyard and watched the other women. Some had visible bruises, others carried that internal pain that doesn't need marks to be seen. Slowly, without realizing it, she began striking up small conversations about the overly strong coffee, the endless rain, about anything that didn't involve the past. It was strange how, in the midst of so much chaos, everyday life kept moving. One afternoon, as she carefully folded her bedsheets, a habit she hadn't lost, one of the younger residents, no older than 20, approached her for help filling out a housing application. Seeing her hands shake as she held the pen, she felt an instant recognition. that same paralyzing insecurity she'd lived with for years. Without thinking, she sat beside her and began explaining each section, marking the most important boxes with a soft X. It was in that moment, helping someone else, that she realized how much she'd learned, not just about surviving, but about navigating the system that had once trapped her. That night, for the first time, she dreamed of the future instead of reliving the past. They weren't grand dreams, just simple images. A small apartment of her own, her children sleeping safely in their beds, the quiet of a night without threatening footsteps in the hallway. When she woke, she knew the road would be long, full of obstacles and hard days. But she also knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would never again let anyone steal the peace she was learning to build. The first supervised visit with her children came 2 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon. The visitation center was a small room with colorful plastic furniture and walls decorated with children's drawings. She sat waiting in an uncomfortable chair, her nails digging into her palms without her realizing it. When they finally walked in, with their school backpacks and disbelieving faces, the world seemed to stop. The hug that followed was so tight it hurt her chest, but she didn't want to let go. She noticed details that would have escaped her before: how her oldest had grown almost 2 inches, how the youngest now wore glasses, small changes that reminded her of all the lost time. The social worker gave them space, observing from a discreet distance as they talked about trivial things: school, friends, their grandmother's dog. It was her youngest, only 7 years old, who finally broke the unspoken tension with a direct question. "Why did we have to leave home?" The rehearsed answer vanished from her lips. Instead, she made an instant decision and spoke with measured honesty. "Sometimes the people who are supposed to take care of us hurt us instead, and it's okay to walk away." The look of relief on her oldest daughter's face told her she'd made the right choice. That hour together passed too quickly, and when it was time to say goodbye, instead of the tears she'd expected, her children promised to be strong and wait patiently until they could be together again. Watching them leave, escorted by the social worker, she felt something new blooming inside her. Not just the same love as always, but a deep respect for these small humans who were learning, just like her, to rebuild from the ashes. That night back at the shelter, she wrote a letter for each of them. Words they might not understand now, but someday, when all this was just a distant memory, they could read and know how hard their mother had fought for a better life. The day of the court hearing arrived with a scorching sun that made the asphalt gleam. The dress she wore, bought with the clothing vouchers from the shelter, was a little too big, but it was the nicest thing she had. In the courtroom, waiting for her case to be called, she watched as he walked in with his lawyer, dressed in a suit she had ironed countless times in another life. His physical presence no longer paralyzed her with fear, though her hands were still sweaty. When it was her turn to testify, every word that left her mouth came out louder and clearer than she'd expected. She spoke of nights locked in the bathroom, of veiled threats, of the constant fear that had become her shadow. The judge, an older man with glasses that fogged slightly from the heat, listened intently as she described the day of her escape with a precision that surprised even her. There was a moment, just as she recounted packing her children's photos, when her voice wavered, but she kept going. It wasn't fear that stopped her, but the overwhelming realization that, for the first time in years, someone with real power was hearing her truth. When she finished, the silence in the room was so thick she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The judge's decision was swift and firm: a permanent restraining order, temporary custody for her, and mandatory rehab for him. Leaving the courtroom, leaning on the arm of the social worker who'd supported her through the process, she didn't feel the euphoria she might have expected, but a deep exhaustion mixed with a strange emptiness. It was as if, after all those years of survival, part of her had been holding her breath, and only now, when she could finally exhale, did she realize how much her lungs ached. That night, back at the shelter, she let herself cry for the first time since her escape. Not for him, not for what was lost, but for everything she'd endured in silence that had finally been acknowledged as real and valid. The transition to the halfway house was harder than she'd imagined. After months in the shelter, the sudden independence frightened her almost as much as the violence had. The apartment was tiny, One bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom with peeling paint. But it was hers. The first few nights, she lay awake, accustomed to the constant noise of the shelter, startling at every creak the building made. It was her oldest daughter who, during one of their now unsupervised visits, noticed she still slept with the phone under her pillow, ready to dial 911. "We're safe now, Mom," she said with a wisdom that hurt coming from someone so young. Slowly, she began establishing routines to reclaim her life. On Saturday mornings, she took the kids to the nearby farmer's market, where they bought cheap fruit and flowers to arrange in a plastic vase on the table. It was during one of these outings that she first met a neighbor, an older woman carrying her own grocery bags. The offer to help came almost instinctively, and though the woman was hesitant at first, they soon began chatting during these chance encounters. They never talked about the past. The neighbor seemed to understand that some stories didn't need to be told to be recognized. A month after moving in, she received a letter from the court confirming her temporary custody had become permanent. That afternoon, after dropping the kids at school, she sat on the kitchen floor, her back against the fridge, and cried silently. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something more complex. The realization that after waiting so long for someone to rescue her, she had done it herself with her own broken hands and weary heart. That night, when the kids came home, they found the letter stuck to the fridge with a magnet, and though they might not have fully understood its importance, they celebrated with the cheap pizza she'd bought as a treat. Watching them laugh, cheese dangling from their mouths, she knew no scar, no occasional nightmare, no painful memory could overshadow this moment, the first of many in their new life. The job came by chance, as the best opportunities often do. The older neighbor, Doña Carmen, turned out to be the aunt of the owner of a small cafe 3 blocks from her apartment. "They need someone for the morning shift," she said one day, dropping the information as if it were nothing. Her first shift was a disaster. She burned 2 coffees, mixed up orders, and forgot how to work the register. But the owner, a quiet man with tired eyes, gave her a second chance, and then a third. Over time, regulars started asking for her by name, and the tips left in the glass jar became the extra money she used to take the kids to the movies on Sundays. It was at that cafe, serving coffee to an on-duty cop, that she learned he had violated the restraining order and was back in jail. The news should have made her happy, but instead she just felt a strange hollowness. The person who once had so much power over her life was now just a name on a police report, while she kept moving forward, building something he could never touch. A year after her escape, she got a letter from the state victim's office saying she qualified for college assistance. The nights she used to spend watching TV for distraction were now filled with applications and reviewing long-forgotten study materials. Her oldest daughter, seeing her struggle with a basic algebra book one night, sat beside her and began explaining the problems with the patience of a born teacher. It was in that moment, with her daughter teaching her simple equations under the dim kitchen light, that she understood her real victory hadn't been escaping or even surviving, but creating this space where learning and growth were possible again, where fear no longer made the rules, where her children could watch her fail and try again without fear of consequences, where family was no longer a word loaded with danger, but with possibility. Today, 5 years after that cold dawn, she sits on the small balcony of her apartment, a slightly bigger one now with 2 bedrooms, and watches her kids make breakfast to celebrate her graduation. The social work diploma she earned last week rests on the dining table, waiting to be framed. Doña Carmen, now an honorary grandmother to her children, directs them from the kitchen on how not to burn the pancakes. The road hasn't been perfect. There are still nights she wakes up startled, moments when a raised voice on the street makes her tense, days when the weight of the past feels too heavy. But now she knows those moments pass and calm always follows. At the cafe where she still works weekends, she keeps a list of emergency numbers and shelters in a drawer under the register, ready for any woman who walks in with that look she knows too well. Sometimes, when she dares, she shares fragments of her story. Not all of it, not at once, but enough so they know escape is possible, that there's life after fear. Her kids, now teenagers, talk openly about healthy relationships at the dinner table. correcting each other with the confidence of those who've never had to tiptoe in their own home. As the morning sun lights up the slightly burnt pancakes they bring her on a tray, surrounded by this imperfect but genuine love, she thinks of the woman who once packed her most important belongings in a broken backpack. She wishes she could tell her everything would be okay, that it would be worth it, but she knows that version of herself wouldn't have believed it. So instead, in the quiet of her heart, she simply says, "Thank you for being brave enough to escape, strong enough to stay standing, and wise enough in the end to let herself bloom again." The road still stretches ahead, with its bumps and its joys, but for the first time in her life, it's a road she's chosen for herself. And that, more than any diploma, apartment, or perfect pancake, is her real victory.